7 factory workers and a 10-year-old girl vanished without a trace in 1985. For 2 decades, the town was told they'd simply walked away, leaving their lives behind. But when an abandoned factory was reopened, a chilling secret inside revealed. The truth was far darker. The old Mayfield tool and fastener plant had been the heartbeat of Miller's Ferry, Ohio, for more than 40 years. Its red brick walls, thick smokestacks, and endless drone of machines carried the rhythm of the town. Everyone knew someone who'd worked a shift there. The factory whistle cut through each dawn and dusk, setting people's clocks better than any church bell. But by the mid-1980s, the heartbeat had grown erratic. Automation was replacing men, layoffs came in waves, and whispers of closure spread through every diner booth. The union fought, management tightened, and workers grew anxious. Families who had depended on steady paychecks for generations were left to wonder if their mortgages would outlast their jobs. It was during this tense, uncertain summer of 1985 that 7 workers and 1 child walked into Mayfield for a Saturday overtime shift and were never seen again. The photograph from that afternoon would become a relic. Someone snapped it outside the factory wall near the east doorway. They stand in a row, Ray and Jolene Maddox, husband and wife, assembly line operators. Their daughter Annie, 10 years old, brought along because Jolene's mother was sick that day and couldn't watch her. Bud and Miriam Cutter, a couple, who had been married for 30 years. Their hands always stained from grease. Sam Hart Harmon, maintenance, the one who could fix anything with a wrench and tape. Tessa Dupree, just 24, saving for community college. Her blonde, hair tucked under a kerchief. Walt Greeley, tall, steady, known for humming hymns on the line when others grew restless. 8 faces, 7 adults, 1 child. Behind them, in the picture, is a wall clock, frozen in the captured image at 3:07 p.m. None of them came home that night. By Sunday morning, alarm spread quickly. Ray and Jolene's relatives were the first to raise concern. Annie's grandmother, sitting at home with the flu, kept staring at the clock and whispering that Jolene should have been back by now. When no one answered the phone, the family drove over to their small ranch house, only to find both cars still missing. Across town, Bud and Miriam's neighbor noticed their porch light burning through the night. She called the sheriff by sunrise. By then, the factory shift supervisor had also reported something odd. None of the 7 had clocked out. Their time cards hung in the rack, stamped only with their arrival. Sheriff Lester Kincaid responded himself. Miller's Ferry wasn't the sort of place that could afford a large department. Kincaid had worked farm accidents, bar fights, and the occasional runaway, but never something like this. He drove his cruiser to Mayfield Tool and Fastener, where the gates hung open as usual, the Saturday skeleton crew already gone home. Inside, the plant was silent except for the creak of cooling steel. The floor smelled faintly of oil, burnt metal, and that heavy dust unique to old machinery. Kincaid called out into the cavernous space, his voice swallowed by echo. He searched the line, the break room, even the foreman's office, but found no sign of the missing. The 7 workers and 1 child had simply disappeared. The investigation began with predictable theories. Perhaps they had left together. A spontaneous outing, a union protest. Maybe an accident sent them down some back road, but by Monday those theories collapsed. None of their cars had been spotted on the highways. Their purses, jackets, and in some cases, pay envelopes from Friday remained at home, and Annie's schoolbook still lay open on her desk, waiting for her handwriting. The plant became the focus. Deputies combed through the building, their flashlights cutting across greasy machinery. They checked storage rooms, restrooms, supply. Closets. The factory's basement, a maze of pipes and steam tunnels, echoed with each step but yielded nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle, no overturned chairs. It was as though 8 people had walked into the belly of the factory and dissolved into thin air. Then came the rumors. Some said Ray Maddox had argued with management over safety conditions. Others whispered about Bud Cutter's gambling debts. A few even pointed fingers at the union, claiming maybe the disappearance was some kind of radical protest gone wrong. And always the most chilling theory, that a stranger's van had been parked near the loading dock that afternoon, and that someone or something had lured them inside. Sheriff Kincaid faced pressure from all sides. Families wanted answers. Management wanted the factory's reputation protected. The union wanted justice, but feared blame. He requested help from state investigators, but with no evidence of foul play, the case fell into limbo. For weeks, Miller's Ferry lived in suspended disbelief. Vigils were held. Flyers with the group photo were taped to telephone poles. Searches extended into nearby woods, rivers, and abandoned quarries. Helicopters buzzed overhead, scanning fields for vehicles. Nothing turned up. By autumn, the factory laid off another 50 workers, shuttering one wing entirely. The missing were spoken of less each week, as if silence might heal the wound. But the absence was everywhere. Empty pews at church, unpaid. Tabs at Mackey's diner, a third-grade desk that stayed vacant. What lingered most was Annie. A 10-year-old doesn't simply vanish without trace. Her friends kept her seat open at birthday parties for months. Teachers left her name on the roll call through Christmas. The town's grief clung to her most of all, because adults make choices, but children are stolen. Years passed. The factory limped on until 1990, when its gates closed for good. Weeds grew in cracks where men once carried their lunch pails. Windows shattered, pigeons nested, and graffiti claimed the brick. Teenagers dared each other to sneak inside. Drifters sheltered there on cold nights. But the mystery of 1985 remained unsolved. No bodies, no vehicles, no answers. 8 people erased. Then, in the winter of 2005, a violent storm swept through Miller's Ferry. Wind tore tin from rooftops. Lightning struck the water tower, and part of the factory roof caved in. When the storm cleared, a side wall crumbled just enough to reveal something hidden, a narrow cavity sealed between the brick exterior and the concrete firewall inside. From that gap, a handful of brittle papers spilled onto the ground, soaked. In rain, a city worker cleaning debris bent to pick them up. They were old employee time cards, curled, water-stained, but still legible, and on top of the pile was a name that froze him in place. Maddox, R. Stamped, August 17th, 1985, 10:22 p.m. It was the last record of Ray Maddox, punched long after the factory was supposed to have been empty. The secret that Miller's Ferry had buried under years of rust and silence was beginning to claw its way back into daylight. The stack of time cards was fragile as dried leaves, but when Sheriff Naomi Breck held them in her gloved hands, they felt like dynamite. She had been elected just 2 years earlier, inheriting the ghost of the case from her predecessor Lester. Kincaid, who had retired with his reputation permanently scarred by the unsolved disappearance. Naomi was younger than most remembered sheriffs being, early 40s, dark hair pulled back, eyes steady. She had grown up in Miller's Ferry, same as everyone else, and she remembered the summer of 1985 in painful detail. She'd been a teenager then, working part-time at Mackey's diner. She remembered pouring coffee for Ray Maddox the day before he vanished. She remembered Annie twirling a straw wrapper into curls. She remembered the town, waking up to the news and feeling like the floor had given out from beneath them. Now, 20 years later, she was holding evidence that shouldn't exist. The storm had collapsed a section of brick, exposing a hollow chamber no one knew was there. Inside the cavity, wedged tight against the firewall, were dozens of time cards. Most were blank. A few bore names of workers from that fateful shift, and one, Ray Maddox's, had been stamped at 10:22 p.m., nearly 7 hours after the group was last seen. This isn't right. Naomi muttered in the factory's shadow, her breath hanging white in the cold. The shift ended at 3. The city worker who'd discovered the cards shifted uneasily. Maybe it's a misprint or a kid's prank. But Naomi shook her head. Time clocks don't prank. And this card had been sealed in a wall since the mid-80s, when word spread through town that something had been found at Mayfield Tool. The old grief stirred like embers catching wind. Families who had learned to live with silence now drove past the factory, parking along the cracked curb, just to stand and watch the wrecked wall. The Maddox relatives returned, older and heavier, their hair silvered. Annie's grandmother now, frail and confined to a wheelchair, had tears in her eyes when Naomi showed her the card through a plastic sleeve. "That's his handwriting," she whispered, pointing at the scrawled R. Maddox. "I used to tell him he pressed too hard on the pen, said he was going to dig holes through the paper one day. That's him, that's Ray." The card was more than paper. It was proof that the night wasn't what people thought. It was proof that someone had stayed late, or had been forced to. Naomi assembled a task force, 2 deputies, a state crime lab technician, and herself. The factory, long abandoned, was sealed off with new tape. They worked methodically, section by section, documenting the collapsed wall, photographing every fragment. The hollow space wasn't large, just a thin corridor between layers of construction. Old cigarette butts, wrappers, and a few discarded tools lay inside. But the time cards, stacked in a discolored box eaten by mildew, stood out. "How'd they end up here?" Deputy Collins asked. "They should have been in payroll or tossed out when the plant closed, unless someone wanted them hidden," Naomi replied. "The state lab confirmed the cards were authentic, stamped by an original Mayfield Tool time clock. The ink matched others from that era. There was no sign of tampering. Someone had punched Ray Maddox's card at 10:22 p.m., long after the group had supposedly vanished. The discovery cracked the case wide open again. Newspapers across Ohio ran the headline, "Time card found 20 years after factory disappearance. Old wounds reopened." For families, it was hope tangled with dread. For investigators, it was both a lead and a trap, because for every new question answered, 3 more appeared. Naomi began by retracing the original 1985 investigation. She dug into Sheriff Kincaid's dusty files, pulling out yellowed reports and Polaroids. She read interviews with co-workers who described that Saturday overtime shift as routine. A shipment was late, a few machines needed running, nothing unusual. But the interviews had a sameness to them, as if people had been careful, rehearsed even. One name came up again and again: Harold Brewer, the plant foreman. In 1985, he had insisted everyone clocked out by 3. His statement was taken as fact, never challenged. Yet the time card told a different story. Harold Brewer had died in 1999, his grave marked by a Union emblem. But Naomi wondered, had he taken something to the grave with him? She also noticed something else. Among the missing items listed in Kincaid's original report was a set of blueprints for a new machining line. The company had been planning expansion despite rumors of closure. The blueprints vanished the same weekend as the workers. At the time, it was chalked up to sloppy record-keeping, but Naomi wasn't convinced. The town, meanwhile, spun theories with renewed vigor. At Mackey's Diner, voices rose over coffee. "Oh, cups. Management did it," one man grumbled. "They were cutting corners and those workers knew too much." "No," another insisted. "It was the union, a fight gone wrong, and they covered it up." "They found a time card," the waitress reminded them, slapping down a check. "How's a little girl factor into that? You think Annie was part of a labor dispute?" The mention of Annie quieted the table. Nobody wanted to picture a child caught in grown men's battles. Naomi drove to the Maddox home, long sold to another family, its paint peeling, yard overgrown. She stood at the fence and imagined Ray carrying Annie inside after shifts, Jolene leaving her shoes on the porch. These weren't just names on a list. They were lives, habits, rhythms. She spoke with surviving relatives. Jolene's younger sister recalled hearing rumors back then about strange deliveries at night, unmarked trucks idling by the factory long after shifts ended. A neighbor of the Cutters swore Bud had been worried in the weeks before, saying something wasn't right at the plant. None of these whispers had been taken seriously at the time. In 1985, people trusted the factory more than they trusted each other. The company was the lifeline of the town. To accuse it of wrongdoing was unthinkable. 2 weeks into the reopened investigation, Naomi returned to the factory at night. She wanted to hear it in silence, the way it had been when the 8 disappeared. Flashlight in hand, she walked the catwalks above the production floor. The beam caught dust motes and graffiti scrawls, names of teenagers who had dared each other. Inside, near the collapsed wall, she knelt. Something bothered her, the placement of the box of time cards. It wasn't random. It was wedged deliberately behind a crossbeam, as though hidden, not discarded. She pulled on gloves and reached deeper. Her hand brushed something metallic. She tugged, scraping it free. It was an old key ring, rusted, nearly solid. 3 keys dangled. One bore the faded engraving, Storage B12. The following morning, Naomi tracked down a retired janitor, an old man named Leonard Briggs, who had worked nights at Mayfield Tool for 30 years. His memory was shaky, but when she showed him the key, his eyes sharpened. B12, he muttered. That was one of the sub-basement storage rooms. They kept it locked tight, said it was for special inventory. Who had access? Naomi asked. Foreman Brewer, couple supervisors. Nobody else. Even we janitors weren't allowed in there. Naomi's stomach tightened. If the key still fit after 20 years, that room might hold what had been hidden all along. The search team prepared with care. Flashlights, respirators, crowbars. The basement had been flooded in parts for years, and mold clung to walls like velvet. They moved slowly through corridors lined with rusted pipes. Rats scurried ahead, their squeaks echoing off damp concrete. They found the door to B12 at the end of a narrow passage. The key, after some coaxing, turned with a shriek of metal. The door groaned open. The beam of Naomi's flashlight cut into the darkness. Dust swirled in thick layers, wooden crates stacked against walls, old barrels sealed with corroded lids. A sharp chemical tang hit the air, faint but still alive after decades. Collins pulled a cloth over his nose. What the hell is this place? Naomi didn't answer. She crouched, shining her light across the floor. That's when she saw it. A smear, dark against concrete, preserved like a fossil. Old blood, and beside it, crushed into the grime, lay the tiny leather strap of a child's shoe. The smell in storage room B12 clung to the back of the throat, like rust and vinegar. Naomi Breck pulled her respirator tighter, her flashlight trembling slightly as she swept it over the scene. The room had been sealed for 2 decades, but the air still carried a chemical bite, sharp enough to water the eyes. The beam of light fixed again on the floor, the smear of dark stain across the concrete, uneven and brittle with age. Beside it, the scrap of leather, cracked, frayed at the edges, no bigger than the strap from a child's shoe. Collins crouched, squinting through his mask. Could be oil, he whispered, though the look on his face betrayed doubt. Naomi crouched too, touching the edge of the stain with a cotton swab. The residue clung deep maroon beneath the dust. Not oil, not rust, blood, old, dried and stubborn. Her stomach turned, but her voice was steady. Bag it, and the strap too. The crates stacked against the wall were stamped with faint letters, the paint peeling but still legible. MFT property, inventory hold. Some bore dates from 1984 and 1985. When Collins pried one open, the wood splintered like brittle bones. Inside were bundles of old documents, binders marked with production schedules, payroll logs, and a few folded blueprints stained by moisture. Another crate revealed metal canisters, sealed tight. labels flaking. Naomi tilted one toward the light. The faded stencil read, TCE trichloroethylene. She froze. She remembered the word from safety briefings in her academy days, a solvent used in degreasing metal parts, toxic in high exposure, known to cause sickness, cancers, even neurological, and damage. Collins ran a hand through his hair. Why the hell would they lock this stuff down here? Because they weren't supposed to have it, Naomi said quietly. The evidence team moved cautiously, photographing, bagging, sealing samples. Each step stirred dust that coated their boots. And yet, beyond the crates and barrels, it was the shoe strap that held Naomi's eyes. It was small, unmistakably fashioned for a child, Annie Maddox. Her name seemed to seep into the cold concrete, echoing in Naomi's mind. Annie had been 10 years old the summer she vanished, too young to understand unions, contracts, or chemicals, but old enough to carry a doll, to wear leather shoes with straps. Naomi remembered the child clearly. Annie had played softball with Naomi's younger sister. She was quick, sharp-eyed, full of questions. Now all that remained, perhaps, was a scrap of leather buried in a locked room no one was meant to see. When the evidence was shipped to the state lab, the waiting began. Naomi filled the time with interviews, retracing old connections. She spoke with retired workers who still lived nearby, though many were reluctant, decades of silence having hardened into habit. One man, Marvin Cleary, once a machinist, leaned against his porch railing, a cigarette glowing in the dark. "We knew something was off back then," he muttered. Supervisors kept shuffling paperwork, production numbers didn't add up, parts were disappearing. But you didn't ask questions. You needed your job. Naomi pressed him. "Did you ever hear about B12? Cleary's eyes flicked away. "Heard it was off limits. Toxic storage, maybe. But you don't cross a foreman like Brewer." He said, "Stay out," you stayed out. "And the night they vanished?" Naomi asked. Cleary sucked the last of his cigarette, flicked it into the gravel. "All I know is they weren't the type to just walk away. They were good people. They wouldn't leave a kid behind. Something happened in there, Sheriff. And folks like me kept our mouths shut too long. By February 2005, the lab results came back. The smear on the floor was confirmed as human blood. Too degraded for a DNA profile, but consistent with what one would expect from a violent incident, frozen in time. The leather strap was indeed from a child's shoe, size consistent with a 10-year-old girl. The chemical barrels tested positive for trichloroethylene and other solvents, long banned for unregulated storage. Toxic levels were present even after 20 years, enough to poison soil and groundwater. Naomi stared at the report until the words blurred. Blood, a child's shoe, hidden toxins. Theories multiplied like weeds. Had the workers stumbled upon illegal storage that night? Had they threatened to report it? Was Annie simply caught in the middle of a cover-up? The families were brought in one by one to be briefed. Naomi dreaded those conversations most. She sat across from Jolene's surviving sister, Annie's aunt. The woman's hands trembled as she turned the photo of the shoe strap over and over. "Do you mean to tell me my sister, my niece, they were killed in that factory?" she asked, her voice thin. Naomi spoke carefully. "What I can tell you is we found evidence that violence occurred. We don't yet know how or why, but it happened there, not outside. They didn't just disappear into the night." Tears welled. The aunt pressed the strap photo to her chest. "I always told myself Annie was out there somewhere, that maybe she grew up, had a family. You're saying all this time she never left that place?" Naomi didn't answer. Sometimes silence was kinder than false hope. Meanwhile, local media pounced. "Secret chemicals missing workers," one headline screamed. Reporters descended on Miller's Ferry, dredging up every rumor. Television crews parked outside the abandoned factory, their cameras sweeping the broken windows, painting the place. as a haunted tomb. Some locals welcomed the attention, hoping it would finally bring answers. Others cursed the disruption. A few old-timers muttered that the town should let sleeping dogs lie, but the evidence refused to stay buried. Then came a break Naomi hadn't expected. A retired supervisor from Mayfield Tool, living now in Florida, agreed to speak. His name was Richard Vale, and his voice on the phone was brittle with age, but heavy with regret. "I should have come forward years ago," he confessed. "But I was scared. We all were." Naomi pressed him. "Scared of what?" "The company," Vale whispered. "They were cutting deals, hiding chemicals, skimming money off disposal contracts. Brewer knew. He kept things quiet. That Saturday shift. It wasn't just overtime. They were asked to move shipments. Dangerous stuff. The workers figured it out. I think they threatened to go to the union. And that little girl, she wasn't supposed to be there." Naomi's pen shook as she wrote. "What happened to them, Mr. Vale?" The line went quiet for a long time. Finally, his voice cracked. "I don't know for sure. I just know they never walked out alive, and the company made damn sure no one would find proof." The story chilled Naomi to the bone. It matched the evidence too neatly. Toxic barrels, blood on the floor, a hidden room no one should have entered but the company itself. Mayfield Tool and Fastener had declared bankruptcy in 1992. Its executives scattered into other firms, its records shredded or sealed. The trail was colder than ice, and yet Naomi couldn't ignore the possibility that this wasn't just a small-town crime. It might have been corporate murder, an industrial cover-up buried with steel and silence. One night, unable to sleep, Naomi spread the old files across her kitchen table. She studied the workers' photographs, the time cards, the blueprint copies. Her eyes kept drifting back to Annie's face in that final group photo, her smile bright, her hair pulled into braids. Why bring a child into danger? The question gnawed. And why, after 20 years, had the truth finally begun to seep out through a collapsed wall? The answers, Naomi felt certain, lay deeper in the factory. Not in paperwork, not in rumors, but in the bones of the building itself. And so she planned a second search, not just of B12, but of the entire basement maze. Every corridor, every sealed hatch, every forgotten chamber, because if 8 lives had been stolen inside Mayfield, Tool and Fastener, their voices might still be echoing in the dark. The February wind rattled through the broken windows of Mayfield Tool and Fastener as Sheriff Naomi Breck led her team back inside. This time, they weren't just probing one room. They were mapping the entire underbelly of the factory, square, foot by square foot. The basement levels had been constructed in the 1940s during the factory's wartime expansion. According to the surviving blueprints, the tunnels had been designed to store machine parts, solvents, and supplies away from heat. Over time, most of these spaces had been sealed, their doors welded shut when the plant downsized. Now, after 20 years of silence, the walls seemed ready to give up their secrets. Naomi's team worked in pairs, flashlights bobbing, their voices clipped in the echoing dark. Some doors opened with a groan, others required crowbars and brute force. Inside, most rooms were empty, but for rats and collapsed shelving. But every so often, they found something worth pausing for: old barrels with corroded lids, piles of paperwork waterlogged into pulp, scraps of safety signage with yellowed warning triangles. One narrow corridor led to a small chamber with a broken light fixture. When Deputy Collins pushed the door, it collapsed inward with a metallic snap. His flashlight beam swept the floor. "Sheriff?" he called, voice tense. Naomi joined him, her own light revealing the sight. A wooden pallet collapsed under the weight of 3 drums, their sides blistered with rust. Around the base, the concrete was stained in irregular black patterns, as if the drums had bled into the floor. The chemical tang was strong, burning the back of the throat, but it wasn't just the barrels. Half buried in the congealed muck was a scrap of denim, small, torn at the seam. When Naomi leaned closer, her stomach clenched. It wasn't just fabric. It was the hem of a child's jeans, no bigger than Annie Maddox would have worn. The find reignited the family's grief when Naomi broke the news. Some clung to the idea that Annie's clothing fragment didn't mean death, only presence. Others wept, certain the girl had never made it out of the factory alive. For Naomi, the denim raised more questions than it answered. If Annie's clothing was here, why weren't there remains? Had the bodies been moved, hidden deeper, destroyed? Theories spiraled, each more unsettling. Back at the sheriff's office, Naomi pored over the old plant records again. One line in the 1985 reports had always struck her as strange. On the night of the disappearance, the factory's security log recorded one last entry: Dock 3, vehicle entry, 10:40 p.m. The log never specified what vehicle, only that someone had come through the loading dock long after the shift had ended. At the time, it was dismissed as a clerical error, but paired with the time card stamped 10:22 p.m., the entry suddenly looked sinister. Someone had been inside after hours. Someone had moved through the plant, driving out through Dock 3 and 8. Lives had vanished in the span of that hour. Naomi tracked down one of the old security guards still living in town, a man named Earl Whitlock. He was in his 70s now, his frame stooped, his memory patchy but not gone. She met him at his kitchen table, where a radio murmured old country songs in the background. "Dock 3, Naomi asked, sliding him a copy of the log. "Do you remember that night?" Earl frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Been a long time, Sheriff, but I do remember something. Big truck, not one of ours. Didn't recognize the plates. Foreman Brewer waved it through, said it was inventory. But inventory didn't usually roll in at midnight." Naomi's pen scratched across her notebook. "Who was driving?" Earl shook his head. "Didn't see his face, kept his cap low. But I'll tell you this, whatever was in that truck, Brewer didn't want questions asked. He told me to log it and forget it. And I did." He rubbed his temples, voice thick with regret. "I've been living with that for 20 years, Sheriff. I knew something bad happened that night. I just didn't know how bad." The Dock 3 lead changed the direction of the case. Naomi began digging into trucking records, but the trail was faint. Mayfield Tool had contracted dozens of independent haulers over the years. Still, one name surfaced repeatedly in 1985 shipments: Franklin Freight, a small Ohio-based firm that had since dissolved. Through state archives, Naomi discovered that Franklin Freight's owner, Howard Franklin, had died in 1993. But his son, now in his 50s, ran a towing yard 2 counties over. Naomi paid him a visit. The man was wary at first, but when Naomi explained why she had come, he exhaled sharply. "My father hated talking about that factory," he admitted. "Said they made him haul things he never should have. He was scared, even years later." "What kind of things?" Naomi pressed. The man shrugged. "Barrels, drums, said the loads reeked of chemicals. And once, just once, he told me he thought he heard banging from inside one of the trailers." Naomi's blood ran cold. "People? I don't know," the man whispered. He wouldn't say more, just drank himself quiet. "But if you're asking me whether it could have been those missing workers, I think about that a lot." Back at the factory, Naomi and her team turned their attention to Dock 3. The door was rusted shut, its rollers fused by time. With a groan of metal, they forced it open. The loading bay yawned like a dark mouth. The concrete bore faint tire marks, long since dulled by dust, but still etched into the floor. She crouched, running her fingers along them. A truck had been here, all right. Then Collins called from the far end. "Sheriff, you're going to want to see this." Naomi walked over. He was pointing at the wall, where faded lettering had been half scraped away, but still visible under the beam of a flashlight. Spray-painted in hasty strokes were 3 words: "Help us, 8." The letters were smudged, faint, as though someone had tried to scrub them away before the wall was sealed in grime. 8. 7 workers. 1 child. The discovery hit the town like a thunderclap. The photograph of the wall circulated in the press, stirring old wounds and sparking outrage. Theories spread like wildfire. Some claimed the workers had been locked inside a truck, transported against their will. Others believed they'd been killed in the plant, their bodies disposed of with chemical waste. A few suggested something even darker, that company officials had ordered the cover-up, silencing anyone who knew too much. Naomi didn't rule any of it out, but she knew one thing. The message on the wall proved they had been alive. At least, for a moment, after their shift. Someone, maybe all of them, had realized they were trapped, and someone had tried to leave behind a final plea. That night, Naomi drove home in silence, her mind heavy. She parked outside her small house and sat with the engine off, staring at nothing. She thought about Annie again. 10 years old, caught in a nightmare. Had she been the one to scrawl the words, or had one of the adults written for her, desperate to leave a trace? Naomi closed her eyes, listening to the ticking of the cooling engine. This wasn't just an old cold case anymore. It was an open wound, still bleeding into the present, and she knew, with the certainty that kept her awake at night, that the abandoned factory still had more to say. The photograph of the wall, those 3 smeared words, "Help us, 8, ran on the front page of every Ohio paper by March 2005. For Miller's Ferry, it was like being dragged backward through time. The town that had tried to stitch over its scar was suddenly staring at it again, raw and gaping. Outside the shuttered gates of Mayfield Tool, families gathered in small clusters, some carrying candles, some clutching framed photographs. They stood in the cold, eyes fixed on the rusted doors, as if waiting for them to open and the missing to walk out 20 years late. Reporters crowded the sidewalks, their cameras catching faces lined with grief and decades of unanswered questions. Jolene's sister clutched Naomi's arm one evening, tears freezing on her cheeks. "We prayed they'd run away, Sheriff. Prayed they'd made a new life somewhere. But this means they were crying for help, and we didn't hear them." Naomi held her steady, her voice low. Nobody heard, because someone made sure. Those voices were buried. We're going to find out who. The investigation expanded. Forensic teams scoured Dock 3, peeling away layers of grime and paint. Under ultraviolet light, they found faint handprints smeared into the wall. Some large, some small. One impression, barely visible, was unmistakably from a child's palm. The chemical barrels from storage room B12 were shipped under sealed escort to a federal lab. Preliminary analysis confirmed what Naomi suspected: trichloroethylene, benzene, and other volatile solvents. Illegal storage, dangerous concentrations, evidence of long-term leakage. The lab director called Naomi personally. "Sheriff, what you're dealing with isn't just a cold case. These barrels were criminal even by 1985 standards. Someone went to lengths to hide them, and if your missing workers discovered this, well, that would have been reason enough for someone to shut them up." Naomi chased the trucking lead next. Franklin Freight had dissolved long ago, but she tracked down 2 surviving drivers who had worked routes in the mid-80s. One, a wiry man named Donnie McCabe, met her in a roadside diner outside Columbus. His hands shook as he poured sugar into his coffee. "I always knew this would come back," he muttered. "We hauled for Mayfield plenty, drums, crates, sometimes late at night. Foreman Brewer handled the paperwork. But there was one run I'll never forget. August of '85. Naomi leaned in. "Tell me." Donnie's eyes darted around the diner, lowering his voice. They loaded us heavy, told us not to ask questions. The barrels stank. Chemicals, maybe worse. But there was something else. I swear, halfway down Route 18, I heard pounding, faint but real. Like fists on metal, I thought it was in my head. But my buddy, driving behind me, swore he saw my trailer swaying like someone was moving inside. Naomi's pen froze over the page. "Did you stop?" Donnie shook his head miserably. "We were told not to. Said the load was dangerous. If we stopped, we'd lose our jobs. I kept driving. Sheriff, if those people were in there..." His voice broke. "Then I hauled them to their graves." The revelation gutted Naomi. It was one thing to suspect the workers had been removed by force. It was another to hear a man admit he may have transported them, alive, locked in steel. She traced Franklin Freight's records to an industrial landfill site on the outskirts of Cleveland. The property, now a desolate stretch of earth covered in weeds, had once received dozens of Mayfield shipments. Heavy machinery had dug pits 20 feet deep, filled with waste, then capped them with soil and concrete. If the 8 had been inside one of those trailers, their final resting place might lie beneath tons of poisoned earth. Standing at the edge of the landfill, Naomi felt the weight of futility. Even with ground-penetrating radar, the chances of finding remains after 20 years were slim. And yet she couldn't shake the image of Annie pounding her small hands against steel, leaving ghostly prints that faded into silence. Back in Miller's Ferry, public anger swelled. The old Union Hall reopened its doors for the first time in a decade, filled with workers who still carried the plant's dust in their lungs. They demanded accountability. One gray-haired machinist, voice hoarse from years of shouting over factory noise, banged his fist on the table. "They didn't just kill our friends. They killed the town. That factory was our life, and they turned it into a coffin." The mayor, cornered by reporters, issued a tepid statement about cooperating fully. But locals weren't satisfied. Protests swelled outside City Hall, candles mixing with picket signs. For the first time in 20 years, Miller's Ferry was united, not by work, but by grief and fury. Naomi, meanwhile, felt the investigation slipping from her hands into larger currents. Federal agents arrived, drawn by the toxic chemicals and the possibility of interstate crimes. They were polite but distant, their questions circling around environmental violations more than homicide. One agent in a crisp suit pulled her aside. "Sheriff, you're dealing with something that goes beyond missing persons. If Mayfield executives ordered this, you're looking at corporate liability, EPA violations, federal court." "Our focus will be the chemicals," Naomi bristled. "My focus is 8 people who vanished. Chemicals didn't scrawl, 'Help us,' 8 on that wall. People did, and people deserve answers." The agent gave a practiced smile, but his silence said enough. The government cared about barrels, not bones. Late one night, Naomi sat at her desk, files spread like a storm. She flipped again through the testimony of Richard Vail, the retired supervisor who had whispered about hidden deals. His words replayed in her mind. They never walked out alive. She thought of Donnie McCabe, the trucker, trembling as he admitted to hearing pounding from his trailer. She thought of the blood on the basement floor, the denim scrap, the palm print. Of a child. Pieces were forming a shape, but not yet a clear picture. She needed a crack in the wall. A voice from the past willing to say the words no one had dared. That crack came unexpectedly. An anonymous letter arrived at the sheriff's office, postmarked from Cleveland. The envelope contained a single sheet of lined paper, words scrawled, in shaky handwriting. "You're looking in the right places. B12 wasn't the only room. Brewer knew more. Check the boiler tunnels. Follow the pipes." No signature. No return address. Naomi read the note 3 times, her pulse quickening. Boiler tunnels. The factory's heating system had once run beneath the entire building, a warren of narrow concrete passages filled with pipes. Most were sealed when the plant closed. But if someone had hidden evidence, if bodies had been moved, the tunnels could be the graveyard. She assembled her team again at dawn. Flashlights, masks, crowbars. They descended into the boiler access through a rusted hatch near the main floor. The air grew stifling, hot even in February, the walls slick with condensation. Pipes snaked overhead, dripping rust-colored water. The tunnels twisted like veins, some narrowing so tight they had to crawl. Rats scurried ahead of their boots. The stench grew heavier the deeper they went, a mixture of mildew, oil, and something faintly sweet, unmistakably rotten. Collins cursed under his breath. "This place is a tomb." Naomi's beam swept along the walls, catching something odd. Scratches, not random but deliberate. Lines carved into concrete, grouped in fives like tally marks. 10 sets, 15, 20. She counted 80 before the scratches stopped. Her throat tightened. These weren't workers marking shifts. These were prisoners marking days. At the far end of one tunnel, they found a rusted door half buried in collapsed debris. It took 2 crowbars and a hydraulic jack to pry it open. The stale air that spilled out carried a smell Naomi would never forget. Decomposition sealed in concrete. Inside, the beam of her flashlight swept across the room. Wooden pallets, torn burlap sacks, old chains bolted to the wall. And in the corner, a mound of rags that, when touched, disintegrated into fragments of clothing. A blouse patterned in 1980s florals, a man's work shirt, and a child's hair ribbon, blue faded to grey. The blue hair ribbon lay in Naomi's gloved palm, light as dust, yet crushing as stone. She stared at it for a long time in the beam of her flashlight, her throat tightening. Annie Maddox had worn ribbons just like it on the playground, her braids bouncing as she ran bases in summer softball games. Naomi remembered those games. She remembered the little girl's laughter. Now, 20 years later, that laughter had been reduced to a faded scrap hidden in a tunnel that smelled of rust and rot. Behind her, Collins muttered a curse, his light fixed on the tally marks scratched into the wall. 80, he whispered. "That's 80 days. You think they were alive down here that long?" Naomi didn't answer. She didn't want to imagine it. 8 people sealed in a tunnel, chained like animals, marking their days until the mark stopped. The air inside, the chamber was heavy, almost suffocating. The burlap sacks crumbled under their touch, disintegrating into threads. The work shirt still held a Union patch on its breast pocket, the colors faded but visible. A broken chain dangled from the wall bolt, rust eating it away. This wasn't just a storage room, it was a cell. The evidence team worked carefully, photographing every mark, every scrap, bagging fragments for analysis. But Naomi knew in her gut that the truth was no longer buried. It was screaming from the walls. The 8 hadn't just vanished. They'd been taken, held, and silenced. News of the tunnels spread within hours. Word traveled faster than Naomi could control it, slipping from deputies to reporters to neighbors until the whole town buzzed with horror. The families gathered again outside the factory, clutching each other, weeping openly. Annie's grandmother, too frail to stand, was wheeled to the gate in her chair. She pressed the blue ribbon to her lips when Naomi handed it over, trembling so hard the fabric quivered. "She loved these," the old woman whispered. "Every Sunday church dress, blue ribbon in her hair. Lord help me, they left her in that hole." Murmurs turned to shouts. Protesters banged on the factory fence, demanding answers, demanding arrests, demanding to know how an entire shift of workers and a child could be swallowed by a building while the town looked the other way. Miller's Ferry had lived with silence for 20 years. Now silence was no longer an option. Naomi pushed harder. She subpoenaed what remained of Mayfield Tools records from bankruptcy court, though most were shredded relics. She demanded environmental audits from the late 80s, cross-checking delivery, logs and waste manifests. She tracked every mention of Franklin Freight, every bill of lading, every dock entry. one pattern emerged. The weekend of the disappearance, Mayfield's shipments tripled in volume. 3 trucks left Dock 3 in the span of 2 nights, all logged as waste disposal. None ever arrived at their supposed destinations. When Naomi presented this to the state attorney's office, the prosecutor leaned back in his chair, lips tight. "You're talking corporate murder, Sheriff. Workers threaten to blow the whistle, company corrals them, makes them disappear. It's a hell of a theory." "It's more than theory," Naomi said. She slid the photographs across the table, the tally marks, the chains, the ribbon. "It's evidence." The prosecutor's face was pale as he flipped through the images. And the bodies? Naomi's silence was the answer. There were still no bodies, just traces, enough to haunt, but not enough to indict. That night, Naomi drove to Jolene Maddox's old home. The porch sagged, weeds strangled the yard, but she stood there anyway, staring at the doorway where Jolene once carried groceries, where Annie once played hopscotch on the walk. She tried to imagine the terror of that night in 1985. 8 people pulled from the floor, marched into tunnels, chained and abandoned. How long had they begged? How long before hope gave out? Naomi clenched her fists. She promised herself she would not let their final cries fade again. Her break came from a source she hadn't expected. A former plant accountant named Gerald Huxley called her office one afternoon, his voice shaking. He'd been young in 1985, just starting his career. For 2 decades he'd kept silent, but the news of the tunnels, the chains, the ribbon, it had broken him. "I can't carry it anymore," he said. "I know what they did." Naomi met him in a small conference room, her recorder set between them. Huxley twisted his hat in his hands, eyes downcast. It was about the barrels. Brewer and the executives. They were dumping illegally, cutting disposal costs. The workers, that night, stumbled onto the shipment logs. They realized Mayfield was cooking the books. They threatened to go to the union. "And the child," Naomi pressed. "Annie. She wasn't supposed to be there. That made it complicated. Made it worse." Brewer panicked. "They were ordered into the basement, told it was temporary." "But it wasn't. They were kept there, Sheriff, long enough for the company to figure out what to do." Naomi leaned forward. "Do you know who gave that order?" Huxley hesitated, then whispered, "Not just Brewer. Higher. Executives in Cleveland. They decided silence was cheaper than scandal." It was the first time Naomi heard confirmation that the cover-up wasn't local. It reached beyond Miller's Ferry, into boardrooms and ledgers where profit outweighed human lives. But still, there were gaps. Why 80 tally marks? Why so long in the tunnels? Why not kill them outright? Naomi's mind wrestled with the possibilities. Perhaps the workers had been kept alive as leverage, forced into silence under threat. Perhaps the company had debated their fate, wavering between release and disposal. Perhaps Annie's presence complicated decisions. Killing adults was one thing, but a child, theories but not yet answers. Federal pressure mounted. The EPA demanded access to the tunnels, their hazmat teams swarming the site in suits, photographing every barrel, every pipe. Naomi bristled at their presence. They cared about toxins, not the people swallowed by them. Still, she couldn't deny the help. Their ground-penetrating radar identified several sealed voids beneath the factory floor, anomalies that might be chambers like B12. Naomi requested access immediately. The agents hesitated. "These could be unstable," one warned. "Cave-ins. Unlikely. If we open the wrong pocket, the whole foundation could collapse." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Collapse it. Whatever's inside has been buried long enough." The drilling began 2 weeks later. Concrete saws screamed, jackhammers rattled. The ground trembled under heavy machinery. Naomi stood with her team at the edge of the pit as layers of concrete and soil peeled away. The first cavity revealed only more barrels, stacked and forgotten. The second was filled with collapsed rubble. But the third, deeper, hidden beneath. Layers of reinforced concrete was different. When the slab broke, a wave of foul air rushed upward, carrying the unmistakable stench of death sealed too long. Workers gagged, pulling back. Naomi forced herself to step forward, her flashlight piercing the blackness. There, in the hollow, lay what they had been searching for. Bones. A scatter of skeletal remains, jumbled together, tangled with scraps of fabric, rusted tools, and the fragments of lives interrupted. A small skull rested near the edge, still crowned with wisps of hair, turned brittle by time. Naomi's knees weakened. Annie. She whispered the name like a prayer. The factory had finally given up its dead. But as Naomi stared into the pit, one thought cut through her horror. These remains had not been left by accident. They had been sealed deliberately, encased in concrete. Someone had turned Mayfield Tool into a tomb, and someone somewhere had signed the order. The cavity beneath Mayfield Tool smelled of rust, chemicals, and the long silence of death. Naomi stood on the edge, her flashlight trembling as it swept over bones, tangled together in a heap of fabric and rusted chains. The skeletal fragments were too degraded for faces, but the details spoke for themselves. A man's belt buckle stamped "Union Strong", a pair of eyeglasses bent and cracked, one lens still intact. A child's small shoe, curled and brittle with time, resting beside the skull that could only belong to Annie Maddox. Naomi's breath hitched. For 20 years, Miller's Ferry had spoken of the 8 as missing. But there was no missing anymore. There was only murder. The team worked with reverence, documenting, lifting each bone with gloved hands. The remains were boxed carefully, marked, labeled. Families waited outside the fence in the cold, clutching one another as the evidence left. The factory in unmarked vans. When Naomi told them quietly, "We found them," there were no cheers, only sobs that rose and fell like waves. The town of Miller's Ferry had prayed for answers. Now they had them, and answers were heavier than ignorance. Forensic analysis confirmed what Naomi suspected. The 8 had died inside that chamber in August 1985. The bones showed no bullet wounds, no knife marks, but many displayed fractures consistent with blunt force. A few had deep grooves as though from restraints, and toxicologists detected traces of solvents in the marrow, proof that the victims had been exposed to chemical fumes in the tunnels. The story was pieced together slowly, each fragment of testimony fitting into place. Gerald Huxley, the former accountant, came forward again, trembling as he sat across from federal prosecutors. He described late-night meetings between foreman Harold Brewer and Mayfield's executives. He admitted he'd cooked disposal invoices under orders, disguising illegal dumping as maintenance costs. And he confessed that on the night of the disappearance, he'd been told to stay away from the plant. "Something big is being handled," Brewer had said. Retired supervisor Richard Vale, emboldened by the discovery of the remains, added more. "The workers found the truth," he testified. "They confronted Brewer about the barrels. They said they were going to the union. Brewer stalled them, locked them in the boiler tunnels, told them it was temporary. But Cleveland made the call. They weren't going to risk exposure. They decided to make the problem disappear. Disappear. A word that had haunted the town for 2 decades, now revealed as cold corporate language for murder. By spring of 2005, names emerged. Robert Harland, CEO of Mayfield Tool in 1985. Victor Lane, VP of Operations. Edgar Connolly, Head of Compliance. All had moved on to other companies, lucrative careers built on silence. Harland had retired to Florida. Lane sat on the board of an automotive firm. Connolly lectured at a business school. When subpoenas arrived, each denied involvement. But records spoke louder. Naomi's team uncovered a memo dated August 16, 1985, 1 day before the disappearance. It bore Connolly's signature. Containment required, no leaks. Brewer to handle locally until shipment finalized. Containment, not chemicals, people. The executives had ordered Brewer to silence the workers, and when silence became too loud to ignore, they'd sealed them in concrete. The case exploded nationally. Newspapers branded it the factory tomb case. Television anchors recounted the 8 lives, their smiles frozen in the old group photo, their fate hidden under rust. Commentators debated the depth of corporate greed, how profit margins had outweighed human life. Arrests followed. Harland was indicted for conspiracy and homicide, Lane for accessory, Connolly for destruction of evidence. Brewer, long dead, escaped earthly justice, but his name became a curse in Miller's Ferry. Courtrooms filled with families who had aged 20 years waiting for this moment. Jolene's sister testified, her voice shaking as she held Annie's ribbon. They thought nobody would care because we were just factory people, but we cared. We never stopped caring. Verdicts came down one by one. Guilty. The executives were sentenced to life in prison. Their wealth and reputations crumbled. For the families, it wasn't enough. Nothing could be. But it was something. Miller's Ferry changed in the wake of the truth. The old factory, once slated for demolition, was repurposed. The EPA began remediation, scraping out poisoned soil, dismantling rusted drums. But before the bulldozers moved in, the community gathered for a final vigil inside the hollow shell. Candles flickered where the assembly lines once roared. Families placed photographs of the missing at the foot of the Dark 3 wall. Someone taped the words, "Help us," 8 in bold letters, so the plea that had once been ignored would never be forgotten again. The bones of the 8 were laid to rest in a single memorial plot, side by side. A black granite stone bore their names: Ray and Jolene Maddox, Annie Maddox, Bud and Miriam Cutter, Sam Harmon, Tessa Dupree, Walt Greeley. On the day of the burial, the town shut down. Shops closed, schools dismissed. A procession of cars stretched for miles, headlights burning in daylight. People stood silently on porches, hats to hearts, watching the hearse pass. It was not just a funeral. It was a reckoning. For Sheriff Naomi Breck, the case left scars she knew would never fade. She had promised herself she wouldn't let the voices of the 8 go unheard again, and she hadn't. Yet, in quiet moments, the images returned. The palm, print of a child on Dock 3, the tally marks scratched in the dark, the brittle ribbon in her hand. Sometimes in dreams, she heard fists pounding faintly on metal. Sometimes she woke with the sound of Annie's voice, calling for help that came 20 years too late. But she also knew something else. Miller's Ferry had faced its ghosts, named them, dragged them into daylight. Silence no longer ruled. The dead were no longer hidden, and the town, broken but unbowed, could finally breathe again. On a summer morning later that year, Naomi walked past the memorial stone. Fresh flowers had been laid by strangers who had read about the case, moved by the story of 8 forgotten lives. She traced the carved letters of Annie's name with her fingertips. "You're home now," she whispered. The wind stirred the trees, and for a moment, the factory's old whistle seemed to echo again. Not a call to work, but a farewell to the voices that had once been buried beneath its walls.